On tonight's episode of Locked On Lightning, the Lightning depth need to get going because they got some tough foes coming out to round out the 2023 portion of the season, as well as we get back to standings watch. All that coming up and more on today's episode of Locked On Lightning.
You're Locked On Lightning, your daily podcast on the Tampa Bay Lightning. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome to another episode of Locked On Lightning, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I'm your host, Adam Decker. Thank you for joining us on today's episode. And I just like to remind you real quick that today's episode is brought to you by Gametime. Download the Gametime app, create an account, and use the code LOCKEDONNHL for $20 off your first purchase. And I would also like to remind you to subscribe to the podcast. Give us a follow wherever podcasts are distributed in audio form. We are also available on YouTube, so subscribe to our channel there as well. So on this episode, we're talking about the Lightning depth, how important it will be for lines 3 and 4 especially to get going offensively in the coming games, because they're going to be facing off against 4 teams that are currently in the playoffs if they were to end the season by the end of the month. So, and those are very good playoff teams. We'll get into all of that coming up, as well as to round out this show, we will go ahead and look at the standings. Time to really examine them more and more on a weekly, even a daily basis here on the show. So we're starting things off with the Lightning depth, and I'm currently recording this during the Lightning game against the St. Louis Blues, and it's kind of ironic that I wanted to pick that as a choice to discuss about on today's episode, because as I speak, the Lightning are winning 2-0, and their 2 goals are from depth players on this team, Mikey Eyssimont and Tyler Mott. And the reason why I wanted to speak about the lower line players is because, as we all know, as we all should know by now, if you've been following this Lightning team for the last 4 or 5 years, is that championships are built on depth. We see it every year with every Stanley Cup winning team. They always, whether it be in the previous offseason or even at the trade deadline, as we have been accustomed to seeing with the Lightning at least, is that these teams bring in depth players to really just polish off the rest of their lineup. You know, it's always one last player that usually comes in on the 3rd line or the 4th line. And that's really the thing that kind of pushes them over the hump and into the arms of Lord Stanley. And I think for the most part, this Lightning, the players at the bottom of this lineup, I think it's a good blend of characters and a good blend of styles. The issue is we kind of alluded to on, and it goes hand in hand. I guess we could talk about that as well. But as I alluded to on the last episode, is that John Cooper, basically kind of just to recap that for those of you who maybe actually missed that. And if you missed that, go ahead and watch back. It really hits home now. When you look at what John Cooper's been doing with his decision making, with playing a bulk of giving a bulk of the ice time to the second and first lines, it's really doing himself a disservice, because you have these players on the 3rd and 4th line who I think do play well, who do have their moments in which they have been able to contribute and almost even win games, you could say, for the Tampa Bay Lightning squad. And we saw it here tonight. I've always spoken about it. When you see all 4 lines getting in on the action, whether it just be accumulating points or just, even ice time, that's when the Tampa Bay Lightning are playing their best hockey, and we haven't been seeing that consistently. Cooper has not been shy about really just tipping the scales of ice time towards the 1st and 2nd lines, especially when the Lightning have not found their groove early on in games, and you kind of see him get into panic mode and kind of just throw those offensive weapons in the 1st and 2nd line out very early onto the ice. And, I've spoke about on the last episode, that may not always be the best thing because, then that doesn't allow for your third and fourth liners to get going. Or, I think it was the last game, if I'm not mistaken, I believe Mikey Esamont only had about 11 minutes of ice time, which is like ridiculous to even think about. And it shows in the numbers as well when you look over the last 5 games for this Lightning team. I mean, out of the third and fourth lines, only 2 players have scored a goal, and that is Tyler Mott and Alex Barré-Boulet, not counting tonight's game, of course. But that's really what it comes down to, is that, these players need to get going, and it goes hand in hand. And I get why Cooper does it, because, he sees maybe the performance is not coming from where it should be. And maybe he's trying to send a message to his players on the third and fourth line. Listen, I am not shy about cutting your ice time. And if you're not going to be able to contribute, I'm going to have to put more minutes on the guys up front. And that's exactly what he's done. But at the same time, like I'm saying, you kind of have to give those guys more minutes, 11, 12, maybe around 15 minutes of ice time is probably, the sweet spot, maybe a little less, excuse me. But it's one of those things where both sides need to kind of help their case. Cooper needs to give these guys adequate minutes in order to get going. There's not a lot you could really accomplish in 11 minutes of ice time in the NHL. And we all know that it's a very fast and at times also slow moving chess match between two teams trying to figure out what's best for them over the course of a game. And I came into this season, when I look at this Lightning with depth, the players, the supporting cast, the guys like Tyler Mott, I was very high on. And even when it looked like Alex Barré-Boulet was, when it was kind of finally announced or set in stone that he was going to be the guy in the lineup, I was very excited. But really, when you look at it, throughout the course of this year, I mean, it's been really lopsided. I mean, the only guy that I could really say that has played phenomenal, or guys that have played phenomenal to where they've really been a huge help to this team more times than not, have really been Alex Barré-Boulet offensively and Tanner Jeannot. We've seen what Tanner Jeannot has done this year. I think he has had a really, really good bounce back. But really, when it comes to it, and you kind of look at some of the things, as we've constantly looked at on this podcast for the Tampa Bay Lightning, what is really the issue for them is it's kind of a handful of things. And it goes back to their supporting cast of players. And that's really where they need to do better. And I think that John Cooper also would benefit him. It would benefit him by not just, throwing your first and second line guys out there constantly for big minutes every other night, because eventually you're going to burn these guys out. I mean, these guys are in top condition, but, if you constantly let them run ragged, eventually when you get to the playoffs, I mean, you're going to run out of steam if they get to the playoffs, which we'll talk about towards the end of the episode. But I think really this is really the point in the season, whether it be this next week or so, these next couple of weeks or so, or even the beginning of January, the Tampa Bay Lightning need to get their forward guys, their third and fourth lines going. And whether that means shifting things around, we've already saw tonight, Stamkos is playing on the second line, Paul's up front on the first, which I think is a great combination. I would prefer to see Brandon Hagel up there on the first with Point and Kucherov. But, none of that is really set in stone, because we all know Cooper loves to throw Stamkos out there on the first line. And, at this point in time in the last 5 games, I don't blame him, given that Stamkos has kind of had a little bit of an offensive resurgence in his last 5 games. Why not? But at the same time, in a perfect world, if it was up to me at the end of the day, I would like to see Steven Stamkos on the third line with maybe Glendening, Esamont, and Jeannot, maybe probably Jeannot flopped out of there. I think Jeannot has kind of earned, maybe a little bit of a probationary period on the second line, just because I think that, he has that sandpaper mentality, which we all know he has, and he's very physical. He may not be as fast as maybe some of the stereotypical players that you would see on a second line forward position, but at the same time, I think that you throw him up there, it kind of also protects a guy like Hagel, as well as, Cirelli doesn't have to bear the brunt of the physicality on that second line. You have another guy out there in Tanner Jeannot that can very easily camp out in front of the net and create a lot of traffic for a guy like Hagel and for guys like on the defensive core in a Sergachev and in a Perbix, who another guy who I think needs to get going. It doesn't just come down to the third and fourth lines for the Tampa Bay Lightning team when you were talking about depth. It really comes down to all four lines as well as the three defensive combinations, especially 2 and 3. I think that Sergachev needs to get going. Perbix is slowly playing himself out of the second line. He started out the year on the first line. He's already lost that position, in my opinion. Chernak's up there tonight, at least for the time being. And I think that eventually, if he does not improve, we might very well see him on that third line with Hayden Fleury or Calvin DeHaan, whoever's there on any given night. So we'll have to wait and see. And I really think that at the end of the day, it comes down to the coaching. If the coach can't get these guys going with a little bit more ice time, then maybe it's time to shuffle things around, which, at this point in time is the perfect thing to do, given that, you're still kind of figuring it out. Like I said, I think if anything's going to get moved around, I think once Stamkos does eventually do cool off, I think that he will be on the third line at some point. I think when you look at that third line, you can't break up Esamont and Glendening. I think they've played very well this year, especially Glendening, who has really become the best face-off guy on this team for the Tampa Bay Lightning. So we'll keep an eye on that, as well as keep our eye on this game against the St. Louis Blues. And coming up, we'll talk about more formidable foes for the Tampa Bay Lightning coming up on the schedule to round out 2023. 4 playoff teams. We'll talk about them, as well as the real expectations surrounding those games coming up for the Tampa Bay Lightning in just a little bit. But first, I want to talk about the first of our 2 sponsors on today's show, and that is our friends over at FanDuel. Now, as the weather gets colder, the NFL offers stay hot on FanDuel. Right now, new customers get $150 in bonus bets with any winning $5 money line bet. That's $150 if your team wins. Now, if you've been thinking about joining FanDuel, there's no better time to get it on the action. The app is so easy to use. There's a wider range of betting options, including spreads, player props, over-unders, and more. So visit FanDuel.com/lockedon and kick off your NFL season. FanDuel, the official partner of the NFL. So as always, I want to thank everybody for making us your first listen of the day. And if you haven't already done so, please go ahead and subscribe to the podcast. Give us a follow wherever podcasts are distributed in audio form. You could also subscribe to us on our YouTube page. Hit the thumbs up button below this video, as well as drop a comment below. How are you feeling about this team? We always like to invite everybody to the Locked On Lightning feelings hour. That is the comments on YouTube. And if you want to ask a question that you want answered on the show, just specify and go ahead and do that in the comments. Or you could hit me up on Twitter as well at DenkyDank, DenkyD8NK. I love hearing from all of you. I love the back and forth. You could tweet to me, or you could slide in my DMs with a comment. So we're looking forward, even though we're keeping our eye on this Tampa Bay Lightning game tonight against the St. Louis Blues, which, I think it's almost cliche to say that every game is a big game, but it really is for the Tampa Bay Lightning, given who is coming up on the schedule for them. They got, after tonight's game, they're off, and then they're back at it on Thursday against the Vegas Golden Knights. And then they're on the road for one in D.C. against the Capitals. And then you got the Florida Panthers on the 27th, the Rangers on the 30th, and then they wrap things up on the 31st against the Montreal Canadiens. And when I look at these upcoming 4 games, and if you've been a listener of the show for quite some time, you kind of already know where I'm going with this. It's that I prefer, especially after a game like this, where you look at a team like the St. Louis Blues, who, in my opinion, are not a good team, and their record shows it. They're 15, 14-1, 6th out in their division out in the Central. And a team that the Lightning should very well defeat tonight, as they are currently up 3-0 in that one. I like the way when the schedule works out for this, when they don't play necessarily a good team and then they get back right into it a night or two later against one of the better teams in the league. And I think it's kind of a good kind of ego check moment. And I'm not saying that the Lightning are getting, full of themselves for beating teams that are not good. That's really not the way it should be. But they do gain a bit amount of confidence from these wins, as they should. But at the same time, you always want from your hockey team, when you're looking at the schedule, whether if they go on a little bit of a winning streak or a big winning streak, you always want to look at the quality of those wins. Now, if the Lightning go out there and they win the next 5, but those 4 are against teams that are not in the playoffs, then yeah, you kind of have to look at that and say, well, you know what, that winning streak was kind of more so of a product of the schedule, where you look at the Lightning in their next 5, they got very good teams ahead of them, all teams that are playoff contenders, or really, if the season ended today, would be in the playoffs. And I think that if the Lightning come out of that stretch at 500, I think that is a good place to be, especially for this team, especially from where our expectations, or how far our expectations really have fallen for this Tampa Bay Lightning team. And, I'm not saying don't celebrate a win if it's against a lower level team. No, but I think that anytime we get a chance to evaluate this team in the season, I think is a blessing in disguise, because as we know with this Lightning team, on some nights, depending on, who they're playing against, you never know what's going to happen. And even in this game against St. Louis tonight, yeah, they're up 3-0 going into the second period, but they could easily give this game right back to them in the second period, and as well as the third. But that's where, regardless if they go on to win tonight, and if they go on to win by a large margin, I think going in, especially against a team like Vegas, is going to be a very humbling experience. Vegas is very organized. They're very big. They're a team that's not afraid to go out there and be aggressive, as well as throw their weight around. And I think that the Lightning also play well in games like that. But I also think it allows the Lightning in those kind of games to kind of reassert where they're at in terms of what kind of style they want to play. Because I've said it on past episodes, I've always thought that this team could play very, very many different styles of hockey out there, whether it be just straight defense, straight physical. Now with Vasilevsky, that kind of opens up the door for a lot more possibilities. But this team has always kind of been a chameleon when it comes to things thrown at them. As long as they're playing well, if they kind of go out there and don't pay attention to the flow of the game to a certain extent, it's going to hurt themselves. And then they pick their heads up in the third period and they're down by a lot to a little. And this 4-game stretch against Vegas, Washington, Florida, and New York is really going to test not only their just their level of talent, but their mental toughness, because it kind of looks, it'll kind of feel in the next week or so that the Lightning are kind of playing a best of 4 playoff series, because that's really what it's going to be like, especially on the 27th when they're going up against their in-state rivals. That's going to be an absolutely crazy game. Depending on, it really doesn't depend on it. It's disregardless of the score, that's going to be a physical game. That's going to be a game where those two teams are going to be going at it for every second, every shift, for every puck. And I think that's the best thing that we could ask for at this point in the season, especially when Andrei Vasilevsky is still figuring it out. We're seeing glimpses of what he could be, what he has been in the past. And I think that's going to be a good test for him. I think it's going to allow us to see where he's at, especially against the big boys. You kind of look at the last couple of games the Lightning have played, or the whole month of December. It's kind of been up and down for the Lightning in terms of what level of opponents that they're facing. I mean, they've had Dallas twice. They've come out of they've bounced back from a horrible game on the first Saturday of the month on the 2nd, and came back and shut them out. And Dallas is a very good team, if not one of the best in the West. And then you win a tight one against the Penguins, and then you get completely outplayed by a Nashville team who I think it's 50-50. They're one of those Jekyll and Hyde teams, so we're not going to get too hard on the Lightning for that. But then they turn around and win a great one in overtime against Seattle, who is another good team, and then just completely fall flat on their face against Vancouver. And I think that we might see a little bit of that in these next 4 games. I hope not. I hope that at least, if the Lightning are going to come out of this winners of 2 of the 4, I would at least hope that they're all tight games, that are all kind of, you don't see that much between these that separates these 2 teams on the ice. So I really, that's my hope for the Lightning, but I think that it's one of the better times of the schedule that we kind of get to be positive for the Tampa Bay Lightning team, because it's an in-season evaluation as the team is still kind of figuring it out, and that's the best thing you could have for your Lightning team. So in just a little bit coming up, we'll talk about the standings. We've been, as the clock and the calendar has shifted towards November, December, as it will slowly in a couple of weeks turn into 2024, we could finally look at the standings and start to sweat a little bit more than what we were in the beginning of the season with where the Lightning are in the standings. We'll do that in just a bit coming up. But first, I want to talk about our friends and sponsors from Gametime. Now, listen, if you haven't heard of Gametime, listen up, because the holiday season is here. Christmas is later this week. If you haven't gotten a gift, first of all, what are you doing? What are you waiting for? But if you're in a bind and you still don't know what to get that special person in your life, guess what? Gametime is the best app to do that, because they got all the options to buy tickets for you, to buy tickets for all the great events that you want to go to, whether it be sports, music, comedy, theater events near you, with killer last-minute deals, all-in prices, and views from your seat. Their best price guarantee. Gametime takes the guesswork out of buying tickets. I always talk about it on the show. Last year, I waited till the absolute last minute to buy tickets to Rangers Lightning last year, and I bought those tickets on last minute outside of Madison Square Garden, and I got awesome seats not that far from the ice. They got last minute tickets, flash deals, zone deals, easy to find and buy tickets for every kind of event in your area. Views from all the seats. The days of sitting behind a pole are over. Lowest price guarantee, event cancellation protection, job loss protection. So take the guesswork out of buying tickets with Gametime. Download the Gametime app, create an account, and use the code LOCKEDONNHL for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account and redeem the code LOCKEDONNHL for $20 off. Download Gametime today. Last minute tickets, lowest prices guaranteed. So as always, I want to thank everybody for making us your first listen of the day. If you haven't already done so, please go ahead and subscribe to the podcast. Give us a follow wherever podcasts are distributed in audio form. We are also available on YouTube, so subscribe to the channel. Hit the thumbs up button below this video, as well as drop a comment below it. Let us know how you're feeling about Tampa tonight. Let us know how you're feeling about this stretch of games that are coming up in the next week, and let us know how you're feeling about the standings. And that's what we're talking about right now on the show, because Tampa Bay Lightning, as we all know, it's no secret, and really at this point in time, it is what it is. You just kind of have to slowly build up to a spot in the standings to where the Lightning are in a potential playoff position. Lightning are currently 5th in the Atlantic Division. That's 1 point behind the Detroit Red Wings and 5 behind the Panthers, which, if they make it up there, would be the 3rd playoff spot coming out of the Atlantic Division. But in the wild card is where I'm more concerned about, because, and I've always been kind of in this camp. I would prefer to just look and aim for that 3rd spot, that 3rd playoff spot in the division, rather than worrying, because at that point you're playing against your in-division rivals, where, especially if your division rival is like a point or so behind you in 4th place. That's one thing. That's all you have to worry about. But if you're in the wild card, now you're playing against everybody and their mother, and that's just opening up a whole nother bag of stress. And as it is right now for the Tampa Bay Lightning in the wild card. So I'm just going to list it off from 1 going all the way down to the Lightning. So right now, Carolina and Washington are both in the wild card, those last 2 spots. And then you got Detroit, Jersey, and then the Lightning, with Montreal surprisingly a point behind the Lightning in the wild card spot. And it may seem like a lot because when you look at the wild card, they're 5 down, and the teams that are ahead of them are very good teams, especially Carolina, especially Detroit, as we're all familiar with. We're getting our first look at Washington this week, and the Devils as well are a good team. It's going to be a struggle for them to kind of chisel away, especially when you look at, all those teams that are in front of you. But Carolina is only 2 points ahead of you in reality. So that's not that bad after tonight. I'm not entirely sure if Carolina is currently playing tonight, but, it's not a situation to where we're kind of looking from the outside in thinking, how is this team going to be able to come up with 10 points or something, something of that nature. It's not a scenario in which the Lightning are that far back where it's going to almost take a Herlaken effort for this team to get back into it. And just so we're all aware, the Hurricanes are playing the Knights tonight. So if you're listening to this episode and that game's still going on, go Knights. We're definitely going to be doing a little bit more scoreboard watching in the next couple of months, because that's really what it's going to be from now until the Lightning potentially get back to that 3rd spot in the Atlantic, which is definitely no tall order, given that you have 3 very good teams ahead of you in the division, in Boston, Toronto, and Florida. Toronto and Florida, I with the way those teams have played this year, especially Toronto, and Toronto only having played 28 games and have 38 points to show for it, it's going to be tough. It's going to be tough to keep up with those guys. You kind of have to, unfortunately, the Lightning are in an unfamiliar territory, and they're going to have to hope that, the Panthers falter, the Leafs falter. I don't think Boston's going to falter. Boston is it's still defying the odds. I don't know how they're doing it, but it's going to be one of those scenarios where the Lightning are just going to have to worry about themselves. They're going to have to take it game by game, because I know this isn't going to be something that's going to be going away unless the Lightning completely mess this up and we're going into March and April and they're completely out of it, which I don't think they were. They will be. I think this is going to come down to the wire, if anything, for the Tampa Bay Lightning to get that last playoff spot. And it's all going to go back to what I have said over the last couple episodes. Contributions from the lower part lines of your team. You're going to need everybody to come to the table on how to play in a lot of these games, especially early on. You're going to have to give your goaltender time to figure it out. I mean, that's really, we talk about it all the time on this show, that, more times than not, Tampa's looking at Vasilevsky to pick them up. Well, this year, the script is flipped, and really now Vazzy's going to have to rely on his team, which is a scary thing to say considering the defense has been putrid at times this year. So, so far we're looking at a game tonight that has been very enjoyable to watch as the Lightning score another one, bringing their lead to 4-0. Kucherov gets his 2nd of the night, assisted by Perbix and Paul. And, so far so good. Like I said, the Blues aren't exactly a good team, but we should still celebrate the wins. But, the Lightning got their work cut out for them, as they got a bunch of very good, skilled, very good, disciplined teams coming up in the Knights, the Capitals, the Panthers, and the Rangers, and then eventually the Canadiens, who are only a point behind them right now in the wild card, coming out to close out the new year. So we'll keep track of it as it all unfolds, and we'll be back tomorrow to talk about tonight's game against the St. Louis Blues. Hopefully the Lightning will be able to hold on and win this one. But in the meantime, go ahead and please subscribe to the podcast. Give us a follow wherever podcasts are distributed in audio form, and subscribe to our channel on YouTube, and follow me on social media at Danky Dank, DENKY, and we'll be back to talk more about all the news surrounding the Tampa Bay Lightning. But in the meantime, that's been it for this episode of Locked On Lightning, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. I'm your host, Adam Danker. I'll talk to you in the next one.